economic growth is not infant industry policy. These are countries that have extremely high rates of investment in physical capital. These are countries which have had extremely high rates of investment in human capital and have raised up the educational level of their populations. They've done a great job of going around the world looking for the best technology they could use. And even if you look at countries like Japan and South Korea and you say, okay, they helped infant industries, it's also true that those countries gave even more help to old, aging industries like agriculture instead. So when you think about the causes of growth in those countries, the fundamental ideas of more investment in physical and human capital, more use of technology, have been just far more important than any infant industry policy. Another concern, another reason for protectionism sometimes, is the concern that foreign producers might have an unfair advantage because their nations have lower environmental standards. This is sometimes referred to as a race to the bottom. The argument is that U.S. firms can't compete with dirty industries abroad because they have lower costs, they have lower environmental standards. And the result would be a race to the bottom with lower environmental standards everywhere as countries seek to compete by having the lowest possible environmental costs. Now, this outcome is unlikely on a number of dimensions. It's unlikely because environmental costs are only a small share of total costs, maybe 2% of the total in a country like the United States. Also, as countries get richer, which is part of what happens from international trade, they tend to make their environments cleaner. Richer countries, after all, have more wealth and more resources to spend on cleaning up their environment. It's dirt-poor countries which say, we can't afford to clean things up. Richer countries are more willing to do so. We talked about in the earlier lecture how the environment in the United States, by and large, has been improving over the last 30 years because of the rules reducing pollution. And empirically, even countries like China and Mexico have been getting cleaner air and water in the last couple of decades rather than dirtier, because as they're richer, it's more cost-effective for them to take on the job of reducing environmental pollution. In fact, multinational producers often lead the way in reducing pollution in other countries, because multinational producers bring with them the pollution control technology that was developed in Europe or in the United States, and they use that pollution control technology in the lower income countries as well. So the notion that reducing trade would clean up the environment seems deeply misguided. Another concern over international trade is the problem of predatory pricing, sometimes called dumping. The definition here is that predatory pricing or dumping is the practice of selling below cost. The idea is that you drive out the competition and then you can charge higher prices in the future. Now, this scenario has been alleged for a lot of competitors coming into the United States, like Japanese companies coming in to sell semiconductor chips or color televisions. This process is anti-competitive in the domestic market. We talked about it in the lecture on anti-competitive practices, where you can't drive out the competition and then try and take over and earn monopoly profits. Now, it's easy to find cases where foreign competitors gave U.S. firms great difficulties or even drove U.S. producers out of business. Color televisions and semiconductors give you examples. But predatory pricing isn't just about driving the domestic producer out of business. There's a second part to the story. And it is difficult or impossible to find a case where foreign firms then were able to raise prices and get monopoly profits. After all, they still had to compete with each other. For example, when Japan took a large share of the world car market and steel market, you didn't see an enormous surge of monopoly profits going to Japanese car and steel producers. Instead, there was a continued decline in their prices. It's often true in the administration of laws against dumping that it's become biased in such a way that any time a domestic firm is hurt by imports, they say, well, that must be dumping, that must be unfair trade. But that's not, economically speaking, what dumping is all about. Dumping has to involve not just hurting the domestic producer, but also earning monopoly profits in the future. And that second part doesn't seem to happen. Without that second part, just saying any time a domestic producer is hurt, it's unfair trade, that's a more or less overt method of just protectionism, raw protectionism. Another argument for protectionism is that it's sometimes claimed that certain products are vital to national security. And since they're so important, we shouldn't be relying on foreign suppliers or importing them from abroad. But the logic of this has always kind of escaped me. Imagine that the vital product is oil, and oil is an essential product to the U.S. economy. Well, if it's so important, certainly it makes more sense to import as much of it as we can now and stockpile it, rather than using up all our domestic resources. I mean, if oil is vital, then why drill America first and use up all of America's oil? Shouldn't we instead try and get all the oil possible from other countries as long as we can and conserve our own vital resources as long as possible? If the vital product is a new technology, surely it makes sense to have the best available technology here. And using that technology helps us learn about it and perhaps be able to produce it in the future. It doesn't make sense to say we're going to deny U.S. soldiers the best possible technology in the world because it's not produced in the United States. You want to use it and get to know about it. Moreover, the national security excuse for restricting imports is just very, very easily abused. Let me give you the two most vivid examples of abuse of this excuse. One is, I'm going to read you some congressional testimony. This is from 1962, and at the time, there was some discussion of whether or not to have import protection to shut out imports of scissors and shears from other countries. So, this is the testimony of B.C. Dushla, and he begins by saying, Mr. Chairman and members of the Committee on Ways and Means, my name is B.C. Dushla. I am Vice President of the Acme Shear Company located in Bridgeport, Connecticut. I appear before this committee as President of the Shears, Scissors, and Implement Manufacturers Association. Wow, huh? The only national trade association of domestic manufacturers of scissors and shears. The scissors and shears industry is a distinct industry and should not be confused with the larger industry and flatware industries. This bill could destroy industries such as ours and add to the unemployment problem. We have never requested or suggested that a complete embargo be placed on the import of scissors and shears. All that we have asked for and desire is a fair competitive opportunity, not an advantage. The workers in the domestic scissor and shear industry do not want to become wards of the state. They want to use their skills, which have taken years to develop. These workers are not interested in retraining. Over many years, they have developed a skill they are proud of and want to continue the work they are happy doing. Under the provisions of this bill, it would mean a reduction of at least 20 cents per pair at the retail level for scissors and shears now being retailed at $1 to $1.29 per pair. Manufacturers would be forced to close their doors and discharge their employees. The United States would then become wholly dependent on imported scissors and shears. We cannot understand how it would be in the national interest to permit such a loss. We would lose the skills of employees, the management of the industry, as well as the capital investment in production equipment. In the event of a national emergency, with imports cut off, the United States would be without a source of scissors and shears, basic tools for many industries and trades essential to our defense. The scissor and shear industry is one of the oldest in the world. It was brought to the United States from Germany at the time when the United States needed a new industry, and a scissor and shear industry in particular. Scissors and shears of all sizes and types are used in every school, retail establishment, office, factory, hospital, and home in the United States. Scissors cannot be classified as a luxury, gimmick, or novelty. Scissors are used to separate us from our mothers at birth, to cut our toenails, to trim the leather in our shoes, and used to trim the materials in every piece of clothing that we wear. They're used to cut our fingernails, to trim our mustaches, the hair in our ears and nose, to cut the hair on our heads, even down to the end of the road, when our best suit or dress is cut down the back, so the undertaker can dress us for the last ride. Scissors are truly used from birth to death. They are essential to our health, education, and general welfare. I ask you, gentlemen, is this an industry that should be permitted to become extinct in this country? Well, you know something, people? If scissors and shears are vital, then almost everything gets to be vital. In the 1950s, there was a subsidy given to the mohair industry. And the argument for the mohair industry was that there was some mohair in soldiers' uniforms. And if we didn't support our strategic domestic mohair industry, well, our soldiers would practically be naked going into battle. And that subsidy continues on into the 21st century. National security is real, but it's also just such an easily abused argument. Strategic trade is another argument. It refers to the situation where a natural monopoly might exist in a certain industry. And so subsidizing that industry to help it get established and get a jump on potential competitors could make economic sense. Remember, a natural monopoly is the case where a firm has big economies of scale, so that a single firm will naturally dominate the market and smaller firms won't be able to compete. And it might be that there's only room in the world market for 2 or 3 producers. A standard example would be like Boeing and Airbus producing airplanes. In this case, subsidizing the industry to get it established could help it that could make sense. But you could make an economic argument for subsidizing that kind of an industry. Of course, the question is, can politicians choose these specific industries and give them the right subsidies? It's usually much more sensible to have a direct subsidy through taxes, rather than putting the entire burden on consumers of trying to subsidize that particular industry. In short, there are lots and lots of arguments for protectionism. There are lots and lots of arguments for shutting out imports. At the end of the day, I'm not sure any of them make a whole lot of sense. Remember that this is why countries go out and sign international trade agreements. Just because markets are powerful and they provide gains to trade doesn't mean everybody's going to be happy with them. As we discussed way back in Lecture 3, there are always going to be people on the supply side of the market who think the price is too low. They're going to blame competition, and they're going to go out into the political sector and try and reduce the amount of trade and competition. Democracies don't just add up economic gains and losses, they add up votes. It's very possible in many cases that special interests will be able to influence the political process to do things that are not for the good of the whole. When there are concentrated benefits to some specific and identifiable group, like the scissors and shears industry, then the costs are spread out over a very broad group like consumers. It's going to be quite possible for the political industry to say, we're going to focus on giving benefits to the concentrated group, even if we're going to spread out costs over a much, much larger group. We talked about that dynamic back in Lecture 18 in terms of the incentives for good governance in an economy. The result of this is that governments sign trade agreements. They sign agreements that commit themselves to world trade. It's worth remembering that the world economy experienced a sharp decline in international trade during the interwar years of the 20th century, that is, between World War I through the Great Depression up to World War II. And after that time, there was this recognition that the constriction of trade was bad for all. So an agreement was reached, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, called GATT. And in 1995, GATT sort of morphed into the World Trade Organization, or the WTO. There's also a wide range of regional trade agreements. The best known in the United States is probably the NAFTA agreement, but there's also a free trade agreement across Europe. There are many free trade agreements across Latin America and Asia. In fact, some people say that regional trade agreements are almost a kind of a spaghetti bowl of agreements, with all the strands reaching back and forth from one country to another. In general, this pattern of trade agreements has really been quite successful. The typical tariff, that is the tax on imports, was about 40% back in the 1950s. Think of that. The typical product being imported had a 40% tax on it. Now, as you look around the world, the typical product being imported has a tariff of about 4%. The mission of these international trade agreements has also expanded to cover services, to cover environmental issues, labor issues, and it's obviously been controversial. But overall, it has certainly helped the overall momentum toward creating more free trade. Politically, the big reason for these trade treaties is for the government to protect itself from special interest lobbying. Congressmen can say, oh, we would love to help you, you scissors and shears manufacturers. We'd love to help you, but there's this treaty, and we just can't do so. And so it provides sort of cover for politicians. Overall, the lesson is that protectionism is typically an excuse for subsidizing industry, and typically a bad idea. Where there are reasonable concerns, there are almost always methods other than protectionism that will work better to achieve social goals. Let me tell you just what kind of trade fanatic I am. I'm glad for GATT, I'm glad for WTO, but I would advocate that the United States government unilaterally take down all of its remaining barriers to imports coming into the United States. I believe that such a step would benefit the U.S. economy as a whole, and it would benefit the rest of the world economy too.